Order, and welcome everybody to this meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, when we are going to be considering the Ombudsman's recent report on the management of the state pension changes. We're very grateful to the four people who've joined us for our first panel today. And can I ask each of you very briefly to tell us who you are, starting off with Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Peter Aldous, co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on state pension inequality for women.
Very much. Rebecca Long-Bailey.
I'm Rebecca Long-Bailey, MP, and I'm also the co-chair of the all-party group on the state pension inequality for women.
Very much. Angela Madden.
I'm Angela Madden, chair of the Women Against the WASPI campaign, Women Against State Pension Inequality campaign.
Very much. And Jane Cowley.
I'm Jane Cowley, and I'm the campaign manager for WASPI, Women Against State Pension Inequality.
Well, thank you all for joining us. And let me put, if I may... yes, before I ask you any questions, I need to make a declaration here, which is that I was the Minister for Pensions between May 2005 and May 2006. Part of the period, of course, covered by the report. So that needs to be on the record.
Stephen, can I make a similar declaration, although less significant? I was a minister in the DWP between July 2016 and 17 and may well have answered questions in the House and responded to debates on this subject.
Thank you. So can I put the first question to you? The WASPI campaign started urging supporters to take this case up with the Ombudsman in 2017. Why do you think it's taken so long to get to this point? And how far will the women affected and supporting the campaign and their MPs as well support the proposals in the Ombudsman's report? So why has it taken so long, and what's the response? Who wants to begin?
Good question. I mean, to be fair, there were some hold-ups outside of the PHSO's control. There was a JR taken against the government by another group on another cause, which did actually fail in the end, and was refused the right to appeal. So I suppose it will be for the PHSO to say, did they really have to delay until that made its way through the courts? Another factor in the whole length of the thing was the time taken by the Department of Work and Pensions and the independent case examiner to respond to the initial complaints they received. And given that they only ever produced template letters in response, perhaps that process could have been quicker. There were some minor delays caused by the WASPI campaign. We asked for additional weeks to provide feedback. Often the reports were published days before significant holidays like Christmas a couple of times and Easter. We also felt we had to challenge the original Stage 2 report because it seemed illogical and unlawful. At that time, the PHSO made an almost unprecedented offer to settle out of court as soon as we made the challenge. They took almost a year to reconsider and reissue the report, but it led to a significantly different Stage 2 report, so we still feel we were right to make that challenge. It's probably more for the PHSO to say why the investigation took so long. We always tried to cooperate fully and acted as quickly as we could. During the course of the complaints process, 270,000 WASPI women have died without justice. In fact, another 9 WASPI women may die while we have this evidence session today. There's one of us dying every 13 minutes. So time is not on our side.
Thank you. You else want to comment on why this has taken so long, do you think?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll just say a few brief words. I think Angela has summed up the situation, and obviously she and also the DWP would have been fully involved in the toings and froings in the report. What I would actually just say, standing back slightly as an outsider, it is an incredibly complicated issue that means an enormous amount to a lot of people, and therefore it is right that the Ombudsman took a long time in deliberating, hearing all those different views and coming to their conclusions in their 2 reports.
Okay, thank you. And, sorry, Rebecca, do you want to... No, what's the response to what the Ombudsman is now proposing? How has that been received?
By us, or yeah.
By all means, Angela.
Yeah. We've never campaigned for anything other than some sort of compensation for what we saw as the failures of the Department of Work and Pensions. So we are pleased with the report. It's got, it's identified that there was maladministration. Big tick for us. It's identified that the remedy should be compensation. Big tick for us. It's also laid the report before Parliament, which we're really happy with, because we feel that Parliament is the right place for that decision to be made. The level suggested in the report, we think, is on the low side. So we'd like to talk about that some more later. Yeah.
Rebecca?
Well, I think the report was quite clear in finding maladministration. It highlighted that many women had lost opportunities to make informed decisions about their finances and their future. And it also called for the DWP to apologise to these women. But more importantly than that, it confirmed that there was injustice and that redress should be payable to these women. Now, the appropriate form of that redress, I think it's important to stress that whilst the DWP made certain recommendations, in that PSHO made certain recommendations within the report, the ultimate mechanism for redress and the amount that that mechanism will represent is ultimately to be determined by Parliament. And as Angela has said, the proposals or recommendations, shall we say, in the report for a level 4 injustice scale compensation scheme are very low, given the amount of evidence that we've certainly received as an APPG and the extreme levels of injustice that many of the women that have expressed their situations to us have faced. But for this committee, certainly, I think the point now is that the report makes clear that redress should be payable, and the next step should be to determine what that redress should look like and how Parliament can be given the opportunity to debate and amend proposals put forward by the government.
Thank you. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you. So complainants told the Ombudsman, best yourself, that they doubted DWP's intention to provide a remedy. What was the basis for this doubt or concern?
Well, they've never accepted that they've done anything wrong. For years, they have been, shall we say, hiding behind the Ombudsman's report, saying that they can't possibly speak, they can't meet with us. So we don't feel that they will either willingly or speedily or with a sense of resolving anything, make the right decisions about compensating WASPI women. They've never given us any indication that that's what they would be willing to do.
Have you had any engagement with the department since publication of the report?
No, is the answer to that in one word. We have attempted to meet with the Minister throughout our campaign, but unfortunately those requests have never been accepted. I think that, as Angela has mentioned, the Ombudsman's requirement that the process was conducted and the investigation was conducted in secret, in private, has had a very stifling effect on what could have been a productive relationship between ourselves and the DWP. The DWP has always insisted that they cannot meet with us, they cannot comment whilst the Ombudsman's investigation was ongoing. Whereas I think we would have been very happy to have met with the DWP early on to talk through possible solutions and possible ways forward. So I'm afraid we've not had that opportunity, and we have actually written to the Minister since the report was published, and we've not yet had a response to that letter.
Do you think the DWP is going to accept the Ombudsman's finding of maladministration? What's your sense?
I think the PHSO indicated that they feel that is unlikely, and I think it's probably our view too. I mean, we've only had a statement in the House saying that they will consider the report. The DWP have had the draft report for some considerable time now. They've taken, again, quite some time to consider the report once it's been published, and it does seem to us that they are playing for time and hoping to kick it into the long grass.
Putting compensation aside, and I fully appreciate compensation is going to be, if not the most important thing that yourselves are sort of pushing for. But regarding the sense of injustice that you feel, how important is an apology, and who do you think the apology should come from? Should it come from the ministers who are in charge at the time, when these changes are being made and communication didn't happen, or should it be people now? Who do you think is the most appropriate people to apologise? Bearing in mind the length of time this has gone on and different people involved.
Yeah, I think every party, has had a hand in what's happened here. It started way back in 1995. There has been at least 10 pensions ministers while we've been running this campaign. And I think the apology needs to come from the Department of Work and Pensions in general. So I think the apology from the current administration will be quite important. It needs to be genuine. It needs to acknowledge that we've endured 7 years of DWP denial currently about something which was not our fault. It shouldn't criticise the women for making decisions in the absence of correct information, because all that does is add insult. Years of insult has then been increased by added years of injury, really. And an apology without a commitment to a fair remedy is not an apology at all. So I think that's what we'd like to see from an apology.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about my own casework and constituents that contact me about this issue, and it seems, a lot of this case turns on communication and how people are communicated with and people's understanding. I've got people contacting me who believe that as a consequence of the Ombudsman's decision, they are likely or could get full reinstatement, which obviously is something very, very different. And I don't think for a second, obviously, it's their fault for believing that. There's a lot of miscommunication in something that is so important and so emotive. What's your reflections in terms of the communication that's happening at the moment, in terms of the stages of the case and making sure that people who are affected know the situation and know what potential things could happen in the future?
In terms of the communication and women knowing about it, the DWP's own polls showed that only a minority of women were aware of the changes to their state pension age. And of that minority, a much smaller subset, so an even tinier minority, knew exactly how it would affect them personally. And that's been shown, as I say, by the DWP's own surveys. The DWP did fail to inform women, and even more, they actually knew that they had failed to inform women. So I think that is something that we do need to be bearing clearly in mind as we go forward, that it's not a question of that women might have known, women genuinely did not know.
So perhaps I didn't communicate my question properly. It's right now, it strikes me that there's a danger of, because this is a fiendishly complicated area, that there is a danger of many people misunderstanding exactly what the Ombudsman decision was and the scope of it and the potential changes for women going forwards, particularly around it was a very narrow decision that the Ombudsman made about maladministration regarding communication rather than the policy in itself. And when you look at the compensation, which I know is going to be discussed in a bit more detail and questioning a bit later on, full reinstatement of pension isn't part of that. And I'm just a bit concerned that with the focus of what's happening on this case, that there'll be some people will misunderstand what the implications will mean for them going forwards, if that makes sense.
I think that it was never our campaign to go for restitution. We've always campaigned for compensation. There are some campaigners for restitution, expecting to get their full pension back. We feel that there are many more campaigners who are willing to accept that compensation is the right way forward. Full restitution really would be a fair remedy if the government had broken the law. That's already been decided in court. We've tried throughout the course of our campaign to communicate and manage the expectations of women. We have a large following on social media. We've got members. We've got a website. Our reach is probably hundreds and hundreds and thousands of women, and they do expect compensation. But they expect that compensation to match the injustice that they've suffered. And I think if it does, they'll be satisfied. If it doesn't, then they won't. So I think the level of compensation commensurate to the maladministration is a bit off, and that needs to be considered further.
Thank you. I suspect
Ben, can I just interrupt for a moment? Peter, did you want to come in?
I just wanted to quickly come in, Mr. Chairman, on the issue of an apology. As far as I am concerned, and I'm looking both at the Parliamentary Health Service Ombudsman's remit and also what the DWC say with regard to financial redress, that actually an apology, you don't just want an apology on its own. Apology needs to come along with an explanation of what went wrong, and to make sure, and that it's primarily involved with communication and showing that steps have been taken to ensure that will not be repeated, plus that financial compensation as well. So the three, if you like, come together. That's just the one point I would make on Dr. Spencer's original question.
Thank you very much indeed. Sir Desmond Swain.
WASPI has described the Ombudsman as being very conservative in his findings of injustice and modest in his approach to remedies. Can you explain that? For example, would it have been possible for the PHSO to have identified that there was direct financial loss?
Yes, we always expected that had the Ombudsman found both maladministration and injustice, that we would have been put back in the position we would have been in had the maladministration not occurred. Ombudsman's own words there. And we've looked at the words and examples in the Ombudsman's own guidance on financial remedy that are published on their website today. And I'll just, remind you of some of those words. Cases with extended severe distress or worry lasting over several years, or where there is no prospect of relief in the near term, or severe distress over an extended period. Prolonged financial hardship lasting several years. Hardship over an extended period, over 5 years or more. Now, we've read those words, and we can't understand why the PHSO hasn't seen our cases, which started 12 years ago and are still going on now. So we've had more than 5 years of distress and worry, and quite a long period of financial hardship. Why those words don't match the injustices we know we've had. And yes, you mentioned direct financial loss. We believe that The Ombudsman could have found direct financial loss in the 6 cases, but let's they'll talk about that later. But even if there wasn't financial cases in 6 cases, there are 3.6 million other cases, and we should really allow that there could be financial loss, and perhaps a remedy should allow that there an opportunity for women to prove financial loss, and that onus on evidence shouldn't be too extreme. You know, we can give you an example. Women who were divorced had their divorce settlements based on an age of 60, a pension age of 60. Now that means they were awarded less money in a divorce settlement. Now that to me is clear financial loss. And there are other cases, and we think it would be fair to allow for that to be proven as part of a redress system.
What circumstances would justify compensation above level 4?
I think the PHSO, I think, said quite rightly that it wouldn't be right in this case to do a completely individualised approach to compensation. It would just take far too long, huge delays given on women who've already faced quite significant delays. But we do feel that a standard approach isn't right because there are different factors that come into play. In terms of the things that we'd like to see in a compensation scheme, we've got 3 principles that we'd like it to stick to. We'd like it to be speedy. Because of the delays that have already gone on, we want it to happen within something that can be set up within weeks rather than years. And a scheme that can make fast and straightforward decisions. We don't want anything approaching the Windrush scheme or anything like that. It needs to be very simple, very clear, easy to operate. I think in terms of information women are asked to give, which comes into this tailored approach, it's got to be simple and straightforward information. It's got to be things like their date of birth, their national insurance number, that kind of thing, nothing more complex than that, which they could put in online or perhaps on a short paper form for those women who haven't got access online. And I think women need to be given the benefit of the doubt. We've had many years of women's word being doubted by the DWP, and I think we need to move on from that. And thirdly, and this is where it comes to the one size not fitting all, it's got to be sensitive to the different amounts of notice that women should have had and the notice they actually did have. And there's quite a difference here because some women had 1 year's notice of a 3-month increase to their state pension age. Other women had 18 months' notice of a 6-year increase to their state pension age. Now, it's not difficult to see that the latter group are the ones who are far more likely to have suffered quite difficult consequences because of that lack of knowing. They're the women who will have done things like giving up work because they thought they only had a couple of years to go until they got their state pension. And once having given up work, then found it incredibly difficult to get back into the workforce. I think, as Angela said, there is the issue of direct financial loss, and again, it needs to be some kind of simple scheme where women can put forward objective evidence to show that that has happened. I think that those kind of things means that we can't have a one-size-fits-all. It does have to take account of people's different circumstances.
I think there are two issues. First of all, the Ombudsman has said that there isn't direct financial loss, so you're effectively asking the compensation scheme to overrule the Ombudsman.
Well, or indeed for Parliament to decide that there has been direct financial loss.
Is there not a contradiction between your desire for simplicity and swiftness and minimum information and what the chairman has told us about the ability for people to prove direct financial loss?
I think you're right to point to that issue, and I think it would need to be a two-pronged scheme, as it were, with one section of it operating quickly, swiftly and easily with the recommended levels of compensation tailored to that length of notice, but that can be done very simply on when letters were sent, dates of birth, all known facts. That's not a difficult thing to put into place. And then the other prong of the scheme would, I think, be more difficult and potentially could take a little bit longer because individual cases would need to be looked at.
Rebecca, I think, wanted to come in.
Thanks. No, I think there's a few points that I just wanted to make on the issue of direct loss, and I wouldn't want the committee to get hung up on this particular point specifically. Firstly, the PSHO has made the decision on what direct loss is based on its own guidance. It's not statutory, and therefore it can be amendable on a parliamentary level. But I think it's important to stress that notion of direct loss was made on the premise of the 6 cases that the PSHO was examining. It hasn't looked at the wide range of cases and the other women that have been affected, who in many cases, certainly presenting before the APPG, in our view, have suffered extreme direct loss. Just to add to the point that Jane made, when you kind of broaden it out to that level, you've got 3.5 million, possibly more women who all have individual situations and individual levels of direct loss. And it's important to try and find a scheme that compensates them adequately. But you've also got to look at the resources the department has to be able to do that. And indeed, the PSHO states that the cost and administration and burden of assessing potentially millions of individuals' women's needs to be considered, and that HM Treasury requires compensation schemes to be efficient, effective and deliver value for money. And I think that's why Jane has outlined a broader scheme, potentially with tapers in, that would address for higher levels of compensation for women who were affected severely and lower levels of compensation for those who only lost out by a few weeks, for example.
Thank you. And Peter.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Just commenting on the first of all, it's important, I think, to point out that in the report, the level 4 recommendation, it is a suggestion, not a recommendation. The Ombudsman is leaving it to Parliament to look into this matter further. Back in early 2022, the all-party parliamentary group did submit a representation to the Ombudsman for what we believed the compensation should be, and looking at the various levels, taking into account the evidence that we had received from all around the UK, pretty harrowing evidence in many respects. We had little difficulty in recommending that it should be at level 6. Now, that in itself is, there are, as we've heard, there are varying cases of people who have been impacted. The advantage of going for a level is that it is its simplicity and speed, but it may not compensate properly a number of women who have been impacted. It might overcompensate others who had taken the measures. And I think in a subsequent representation we submitted, and I will pay tribute to my former co-chair Andrew Gwynn on this, he described it as a bell curve type of compensation, whereby those who had received least notice of the longest postponement, i.e. women who were advised that they had a year till their pension went up by 5 years or so, they should receive the most, and those who had received the longest notice, the shortest increase, should receive a lesser amount. Now, I accept that bell curve probably needs an element of refinement, but that would be the sort of approach I would suggest that we should be looking to introduce to take into account the Ombudsman's recommendation that this matter is resolved as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much. David Linden.
Thank you very much, Chair. So in principle, the Ombudsman has said that the amount of redress should reflect individual circumstances, but in reality, a kind of standardised approach might be more appropriate in this case, given just the sheer number affected and the need for that timely remedy, some of which you've touched on. Can I ask the panel, each of you, which would you support? And I'll start with Mr. Aldous.
Well, based on what I've said and what the evidence that we accumulated and the case we put in, we recommended the APPG level 6 back 2 years ago. I don't think we would be shying away and diverting, or I certainly wouldn't be diverting from that recommendation that we made at that stage.
Okay. Does anyone want to demur from
that? I think the main facet of the scheme would have to be rule-based, so that individual cases just aren't re-examined every time. And that rule base would have to be based on the kind of thing that Peter was saying, length of time, length of notice period, length of time that they underwent financial difficulty because there are expectations they hadn't prepared for. So I think it has to be that. But as Jane said before, there is some elements that even within that, there may be direct financial loss that wasn't apparent in the 6 cases. And then if individuals wanted to apply for that, they would have to apply evidence, so that evidence would then need to be examined. But that would be in fewer cases than the mass that we're talking about.
Okay. And so a question specifically to WASPI, I mean, you suggest a scheme based on notice and extent of pension age increase. The Ombudsman says that longer notice does not necessarily mean having a greater chance to do something different. Would you support a system just based on the extent of change in pension age?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So, would you support a system just based on the extent of the change in pension age?
It would depend on the system and where it landed. If the worst affected did get significantly more than level 4, because we believe the worst affected really deserve that level, then I think that would be acceptable.
Yes, I think our view is the worst affected group is the group I spoke about earlier, those who had the shortest notice to the longest delay to their state pension age.
And would means testing be an acceptable way of targeting a response system?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? I'm afraid I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Would means testing
Would a means-tested solution be acceptable? Well, I think when it comes to that, we have to go back to the very fundamental question of what is the scheme for? It's not a welfare benefits scheme. That's not its purpose. It's a scheme to provide remedy for a wide-scale government failure to do the right thing for a group of women who've suffered quite significantly from that failure. It's a remedy for injustice. We do have a separate welfare scheme which attempts to do the right thing by people in difficult circumstances. I think, the means testing question is one that we're asked quite frequently. And I think a good analogy here would be that if there was a car crash and both the driver and the passenger were both equally seriously injured, it would never be suggested for one moment that one should get more compensation than the other because they were poorer. But that's never been the basis of any court system, and it's never been the basis of any compensation scheme, and it really should not come into play here. And also, thinking about other compensation schemes that have been introduced over the last few years, none of those have been based on the financial circumstances of the victims, and I feel it would be a further injustice to WASPI women to make that the case here too. I mean, I think all the women really have suffered injustice and all should have remedy.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I agree with you on that. Going slightly off script here, I've been an MP for almost 7 years, and WASPI was one of the big issues in the 2017 election campaign. And I ask this more just as a sense of reflection for everybody. It strikes me that ministers have relied very heavily on obfuscation, hiding behind court judgments, Is there a view, would it be legitimate to say that the WASPI campaign itself fractured over time, and because of mixed messages, that has also had an impact on the ability of how long this has taken?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think we've always been very clear in what we are looking for. As Andrew has said, some other groups have been looking for the law to be changed, essentially, or for an amount of redress that equals the amount of lost pension. That hasn't been what we have been asking for. We've been looking for something that is reasonable in terms of the lack of notice that we had.
You think those groups have actively hindered the chances of 1950s women in the longer term?
We certainly have heard MPs in the past saying, well, if you all asked for the same thing, everything would be fine. So I suppose it gives those that don't want to move on the issue an excuse not to. So in that way, possibly, because the DWP have shown that they will hide behind anything not to accept that they got something wrong. But perhaps now is the time to stop that game playing if that's been going on.
Absolutely. And just finally, Chair, before we come on to the role of Parliament, which I'm sure Ms Abrahams is going to talk about, a question specifically to the WASPI campaign. We're approaching an election this year. The view has been bat it back to Parliament. Westminster politicians can decide this issue. Do you have a fear that just as there has been injustice for people in the contaminated blood scandal, Horizon scandal, that there is a real risk that as a result of this coming back into the court of Westminster politicians in an election year,
I think
that will delay things even further? And I think it's right that you put on record that 270,000 women have died during this process. I think 9 will die during this hearing. Is the message here that politicians need to put the politics aside and just go on with delivering justice for the 1950s women, even in an election year?
I think so. I mean, we must remember that this is the longest running PHSO investigation that there has ever been. I think it's been probably the costliest in terms of resources and possibly the most demanding and complex that they've undertaken. It's an investigation into maladministration and injustice on a massive scale. 3.8 million women were affected initially. So if ever there is a case that demands a proper response from Parliament, this has to be it. I think there is a danger that it could get lost in politicking. If Parliament isn't able to bring about something which begins to approach justice for WASPI women, I think that it will mean that people will lose faith, not just in the PHSO, but also in the government's readiness to hold itself to account when mistakes of this nature are made. As Peter, I think, said, a refusal to act would drive a coach and horses through the system of checks and balances that are in place on the government itself. It would beg the question of whether there's any point at all in having an ombudsman, and perhaps Ms Hilsenrath will have more to say on that point when she speaks. I think if people see that the PHSO's recommendations are not carried out, they'll know that a public authority can just dig in its heels and refuse to act when things go wrong, refuse to put things right. And that will feed into the public's quite understandable cynicism about the government's and indeed Parliament's ability to do the right thing when things have gone wrong. We had some interesting information this morning. We conducted a poll over the weekend, and you perhaps might be interested to know that 68% of respondents to that poll, which was among the general public, not among WASPI women, 68% of respondents said that the government should act now on this. 68% said that WASPI women have waited too long, and 68% that said that the government should act on the recommendations of the PHSO. What will happen if the government doesn't act? What will WASPI do? Well, we know that a pensions minister, I think it was Baroness Altman some time ago, was told to ignore us and we'd go away. We haven't gone away, and we will not go away. We cannot go away while we've got one woman dying every 13 minutes without justice. We won't just sit back and passively accept that injustice. And we will continue to use whatever power we have in terms of public opinion, strongly on our side, this poll suggests, the media, the political sport. We know that we have many supportive MPs in the House of Commons, and indeed, as it comes to election, the ballot box, and if necessary, the legal system. We will continue to be very active on this issue.
Thank you. Keep going.
Thank you very much. My notes wanted to come in.
Just a quick question, and Mrs. Madden made quite a compelling case about direct loss. I should perhaps declare an interest again for those women who have got divorced and whose divorce settlement might have been predicated on an expected retirement age. But had the Ombudsman come back with a level 6 recommendation instead of level 4, would the WASPI campaign have then dropped the request for tailored compensation?
It would certainly be easier to, but if there has been direct financial loss, we do feel that ought to be recognised as well.
Okay, thank you. And just a quick follow-up. So and I think it was Ms. Cowley referenced the Windrush scheme. I well recall Martin Ford being appointed as the independent advisor on that compensation scheme and how long that took. What do you fear about Parliament stepping in and saying, OK, we'll let Parliament design a scheme, the length of time it might take if an independent advisor of his calibre was required?
I think that it goes back to the point about that any scheme needs to be put together by an Act of Parliament. It needs to be a statutory duty on the DWP, and that Act of Parliament should set strict timescales which Parliament oversees and holds it to account on, because otherwise we do run the risk of going down that path of years dragging on and women not getting the compensation that they should have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter, did you want to come back on something?
No, I'm quite happy with that, Tim.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I've been listening with great interest in terms of what you've just been saying, and particularly in terms of the mechanics really about the development of a scheme and how the scheme might operate. And I think the point that David and Caroline have just made about the length of some of these schemes, so the infected blood inquiry, going back to a scandal that originated in the 1970s. Yeah. Still, there hasn't been an interim payment on those that have been affected. I mean, more and more people have died over the last year since the chairman of the inquiry there said there needed to be an inquiry, an interim payment. So I think that's something we really need to be mindful of. So I would like to start, if I could, with Angela and Jane in relation to, first of all, are you happy with the recommendation from the PHSO around Parliament being the body really that should take charge of a scheme and its and how it might be developed and delivered?
I would just say one thing, and I'll let you. I think we would have been much happier if the DWP had accepted the PHSO's report, had accepted responsibility, and then we could have moved forward from that point. But we're not at that point, so I'll let Angela take over now.
Can I just pick up on that, because I think this is really important and we will be asking the Ombudsman in the next panel about these points, but given that this is a report that has gone to Parliament, so it's bypassed a government department, and the subtle distinction between government and Parliament, and that it'd be interesting to explore that with the Ombudsman in terms of why they decided that it should come to Parliament rather than going to the government, and confidence about a satisfactory response in relation to that. So, but are you content as an organisation, as a member-led organisation, that it has come to Parliament to determine?
Yes. I think we are.
Okay.
And we are for the very reasons you're implying in the question. I mean, the government can railroad Parliament. It can almost undermine the democratic process, especially when it's got such a sizable majority. But I think it's very important that all the MPs have the right to persuade their colleagues of whatever their feelings are in the matter. And we know we have very strong feelings from several hundreds of members of Parliament that we should be given a better deal than the government or the DWP would be prepared to come forward with.
And herein lies the interesting conundrum. So Parliament doesn't decide the business of the House and what legislation is brought forward. That is up to government. So I wondered if you had in your mind what was the mechanism that you thought of that could lead to a bill and the structure and the development of a scheme and its delivery and so on that could come about. I'll come to you in a minute, Peter.
Well, we were hoping one of the mechanisms, like, for example, a backbench business debate, if that could somehow turn into a bill. I mean, we've had several backbench attempts at getting debates. But you're right, unless the government want it to go through, they can merely ignore it, can't they?
Absolutely, yeah.
So, I mean, we noted that the 22 billion Parliament offered to the infected blood scandal was by an amendment to a bill that was already going through Parliament, but there doesn't seem to be a relevant bill that we could do anything about on that.
And that would set up delays and so on. So I'm just Jane, did you have it?
No, I mean I'll defer to our two MPs sitting here.
I just wondered if you might have had legal advice and somebody might have come out, because I'm certainly not a constitutional expert in any ways or mean, but so okay.
It's something we're very much aware of, and something that we will be putting a lot of thought to thinking about how we can bring some change about.
And to my colleagues here, so Becky and Peter. What did you have any view in terms of how this?
I think, well, the first point to make is that it's very rare for the Ombudsman to lay a report before Parliament, and if you read the report, they've done that because they don't believe the DWP will act on their findings, and that's why they've put it within the Parliament's gift to make a decision about what a mechanism for redress should look like.
I mean, but can I just sort of say, sometimes we use the government departments as a separate entity. These are government departments run by ministers, so that's the government. So there was no confidence in the government through their department in the delivery of that scheme. I think we just need to call a spade a spade.
That's right, and there's been no movement so far, as we've heard from the DWP, in acknowledging its failings or issuing an apology, despite how clear it is within the PSHO's report. In terms of what action Parliament can take, I mean, I agree with Angela and Jane that there needs to be some sort of legislative framework that MPs can amend if they're not happy with the proposals put forward by government. But ultimately, we need to see a set of proposals from government urgently.
Okay. Thank you, Sir Peter.
Thanks, Debbie. As has been said, it is normally when the Ombudsman makes a report, issues a report, within minutes it is accompanied fairly quickly by a response from the relevant department saying, yes, we accept these recommendations, we will be putting in place the following measures to address them. Clearly, the Ombudsman was not comfortable they were going to get to that response, and therefore they have handed it over to Parliament to play a lead role in the process. Now, the nature of our constitution, the way Parliament is setting up, there is no silver bullet, if you like, for Parliament to go down to actually get that compensation and respond in place. Parliament does have a variety of mechanisms that can play a role. We as an all-party parliamentary group will be having further evidence sessions with the various groups to come up with our own proposals. You yourselves are extremely influential. You will come up with your roles. There will be debates. There's a debate on the 16th of this month, which I believe will have a motion that will help as well. I would hope that the government will not be a sort of bystander sitting back and saying, right, chaps, we don't need to do anything, and that they will engage and listen and hopefully take part in this process so that we can come to a solution sooner rather than later.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It is tricky though, isn't it? And I think we need to be really, really clear about this to everybody and not raise expectations. So yes, we're, under our fantastic chair, we can produce reports. The government doesn't have to accept them though, do they? And we just need to be absolutely... A motion for a backbench business committee cannot necessarily lead anywhere. I know we've got a private members bill, but that's making a recommendation to the Secretary of State, who can again kick it into the long grass. This needs us to working in a cooperative way, doesn't it? And for us all to pull together to make sure that these women get the justice that they deserve. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. David has a quick point.
Yeah, can I just ask, in the interest, I think, following what Ms Abrahams has said about, keeping expectations clear, just ask parliamentary colleagues to put on the record that even if Parliament was to pass an amendment, the reality is the government still has to bring forward a money resolution, doesn't it? Yeah. So the ball is always going to be in the government's court, regardless of what Parliament does, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can I put a couple of further questions to you? I mean, given what you've sort of been through in all these years of campaigning, what lessons do you think the DWP should learn for its own purposes for the future? What do they need to change for the future?
I think some things have already been written down on paper, and they probably come out from other reviews like the John Cridland review and the 2017 pensions review. And I think it's already been said that people need to have certainty about their future, their state pension, when they're going to get those things. So I think now it's almost accepted, well, it's written down that there should only be a 1-year increase in state pension age every 10 years. And the people who are subject to that increase should have 10 years notice. And that notice should be individually tailored to the people. But there's still no evidence that the DWP has taken that up. So I really do think that the DWP needs to almost act a bit more like its sister department, the HMRC. I mean, we never had to scrabble around and try and look at adverts and find out things about our tax code. They told us every year. When you get a change to your tax code, you get notified every year. And I think something like that needs to happen so that, the whole point of a lot of the communications from the DWP seems to be now about stakeholder pensions and looking after yourself. But they have a responsibility in also telling us how much state pension and when we are going to get that state pension, so that can form part of our planning. Because that's honestly what we do. We plan our life based on what we know. And if we don't know the right things, then how can our plan be the right plan? And the responsibility lies on the government and the government departments to tell us those right things. So they need to take that on board. But they haven't taken any of that feedback on board, wherever it's come from as yet.
Thank you. Peter. Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman. Since 1995, there have been some significant and dramatic changes to the state pension age, both the equalisation and increasing it over the years. I would expect that debate will probably those changes will carry on. What has come out of this is that the means of communication for people to prepare and properly prepare for those changes does need reviewing, and the DWP, if you like, really do need to review their systems and to make sure that, as we've said, that ideally those 10 years of people preparing is actually what actually happens. We're still hearing examples of people getting a year's notice of changes. That is not acceptable.
Jane.
Just one final point, which is perhaps less about the DWP and about the whole issue of the PHSO's report and how it was brought about. Over the long period that the PHSO was investigating, the DWP could refuse to engage with us or indeed with the press or with anybody because they were able to cite the need for the PHSO's investigation to be conducted in private. And even when in the stage 1 of the report was produced in July 2021, which clearly showed that there had been maladministration on the part of the DWP, they were able to avoid comment at that point because they said the investigation is still ongoing and therefore we cannot comment. I don't feel, and perhaps this is a question for PACAC rather than this committee, but I don't feel that that was actually helpful in this case, that it provided a smokescreen for the DWP to hide behind during all that period, rather than having to come forward and say, yes, actually there was maladministration and we're going to have to do something about it.
Interesting point. Rebecca.
Well, just very quickly, just to add to the points that have been made, I think it's important to stress that, firstly, each of the women that were affected should have received an individualised letter informing them of the change to their pension age well in advance, and that didn't happen. But even when that issue was raised with the DWP by this committee, I think, many, many years ago, actions still weren't taken at that time, and indeed the Ombudsman's report said that there was a failure to recognise and respond to research and feedback that showed information about state pension age was not reaching the people who needed it. So there seems to be a constant breakdown in communication, even when the key point is pointed out to the DWP and the actions that they should take are exemplified to them. So that's certainly something that I think might form the basis of a follow-up report by the Ombudsman, but it's something that the committee should consider. But another very brief point that I just wanted to stress, and it kind of touches on a point that Dr. Spencer made earlier. I think it's important to stress that this report is about maladministration. It's about whether women receive notice of the change in their pension age. It doesn't deal with the wider issue of discrimination in the policy itself, and the fact that these women were often a group that were out of work, looking after families, raising children, and then were at a disadvantage compared to their male counterparts when they reached that state pension age. And certainly that's something that I'd like the committee to look at in more detail in the future.
Thank you for that. And lessons about the Ombudsman process. You know, does the Ombudsman, from what you can see, have the powers, resources needed to hold government departments to account? What sort of lessons would you draw about that aspect of what's happened?
Well, it would appear not, if the DWP can just ignore what the Ombudsman says. And that must be very distressing, both on the complainants but also on the Ombudsman themselves. I mean, perhaps that should be a stronger link between what the Ombudsman recommendations are, what they decide, and what the relevant departments have to do.
Okay, can I put a final point? This is a point to you and Angela and Jane. A lot of women did know about these changes. I think the DWP research said 40% or something, wasn't it, were aware of the changes that had been agreed. It was quite widely reported in newspapers, TV and radio and so on. I don't know either of you, but you strike me as the sort of people who probably read the newspapers and listened to the radio news. So looking back on it, why do you think you missed the fact that this change had been legislated?
I think we're going back to 1995 here.
Yeah.
I think you have to think about the age of women at that time, what their lives might have been like. Many of them were not in work. They were at home at that time looking after families. They weren't possibly... There was some coverage in the newspapers, but it was often on the financial pages of the newspapers. Possibly many of those women weren't avid readers of the financial pages. I think, that there was not a proper communications campaign by the DWP at that point. I certainly didn't know about it. I was one of those women who was not working at that time, and I was unaware of it. And I think that that's something that it's quite easy to forget these days when everything is there on the internet at a touch of a button. We're going back to 1995, where news came via the television, via the radio, via the newspaper. It didn't come out through other channels. And I think, the advertising campaign that the DWP put together involved dogs talking to each other, and nobody mentioned women's state pension age changing or anything like that in it. So, I think it is when you put yourself back at that time, it becomes easier to understand how that could happen.
Let me just add another point and bring you in, Angela. To what extent do you think citizens have a responsibility to keep themselves abreast of changes in the laws that affect them?
Well, I'll kind of come in through that last point. I was working full-time. I worked full-time for 42 years. I only had 3 months off work. I never claimed benefits. I didn't really have to interact with government departments because quite a lot of the leaflets that the DWP put their data in actually go to unemployment offices or citizens advice bureaus or places like that. I mean, there was one leaflet that they trumpeted about, and I think they only sent out 42,000 copies, and that went to pensions advisors. Well, I didn't use one of those either. But what I did get for 17 years of my career was benefit statements from a pension scheme that I was in. And those statements told me that the benefits listed in the statement would come in addition to state pension benefits, which would be paid at 60. Now that to me is information that is current. It's from my employer. It's from a trusted source. It's not gossip. It's not an advert. It's not a dog talking to another dog on a beach. So I believe the way the DWP chose to manage that campaign was wrong if they wanted to tell women what their state pension age was going to be, because it was all based at A, women seeing it, B, women then taking an action to do something about it, and things like that. And adverts in newspapers. I mean, I think the Daily Times, one of the Times features was that state pension age is changing, it will be 65 for everybody in 2020. Now, I don't ever recall seeing that until I got involved in the campaign, but if I had, I would have thought, phew, I get my state pension age in 2014, so it will have nothing to do with me at all. So it's just not targeted enough. And
Angela, your employer pension scheme was telling you it was going to be age 60 up until when?
2004 was when I left that.
Right.
So that was a good 9 years after the law had changed.
Yeah.
And should we make ourselves aware of changes in the law? It would be very, very difficult, wouldn't it, for us to be as aware as you are for every change in the law that affected us. I mean, I know the law says that ignorance of the law does not mean, that you can get away with doing something wrong. But, paying your national insurance, doing what you've always done, isn't doing anything wrong.
Just to come directly to your point about should citizens make themselves aware of changes in the law, yes, I agree with that entirely. But in order to do that, the information has to be made available to the citizens. And in our case, the PHSO report has shown very clearly that information wasn't made available to us. How could we have done our duty by making ourselves aware if a proper information campaign wasn't there to help us along that path?
David wants to come in, then we need to...
Just ask those represent WASPI, I mean, is it fair to expect people to be aware of changes in the law when only last week the Prime Minister, who brought in voter ID, turned up at a polling station without voter ID? Are we seriously expecting people to understand the law when lawmakers don't understand it quite sometimes?
Yeah, that's a good
It's
question.
a rhetorical question, David, but yes.
And we have known WASPI women who worked for the Department of Work and Pensions, and they were unaware of the law too.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much indeed for the years of work that I think everybody on the panel actually has put into this, but particularly Angela and Jane and your colleagues, all the work you've done on this, and thank you very much for being willing to speak to us this morning. Order.
The opportunity. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome everybody to our second panel at the Work and Pensions Select Committee this morning for our evidence session on the Ombudsman's report on the changes in women's state pension age. Grateful to both witnesses joining us for our second panel. Can I ask each of you to tell us very briefly who you are, starting with Rebecca Hilsenrath.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Rebecca Hilsenrath. I'm the Interim Parliamentary Ombudsman, Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. I'd like to make a few remarks if I can, but can I pass to my colleague to introduce himself first?
Karl Banister, please do. Yeah.
Hello, so I'm Karl Banister. I'm Director of Operations, Legal and Clinical at the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman. I'm also Deputy Ombudsman.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, you wanted to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you and the committee very much for making time to look at this really important matter with us today. I know that your time is under a huge amount of pressure. As you know, last time I appeared before you, I was the Chief Executive, and I come here today as the Ombudsman. When I was appointed Chief Executive last summer, since that point I've had quite close oversight of this case. Karl supports me today, but generally as the Deputy Ombudsman and as Director of Operations and Legal, he's had very close involvement with this case since its start, but yes, throughout. So it's helpful to have him here.
When was the start, from your point of view? When did this all begin?
2018.
2018, right.
I wanted to touch on a couple of things. The first thing I wanted to say is that I always feel that at the Ombudsman we have two roles. One is to address injustice for individuals. The other is to look at systemic failings in public services. In terms of access to justice for individuals, we received 600 cases on this point, but we do know that it impacted on many hundreds of thousands of other people. But each one of those is a human being whose plans for their retirement were undermined by the handling of the changes to state pension age for women. There's a sense, I guess, in which each of us spend a lot of our lives, all of our lives, planning for our retirement, and that should be a golden time. Autonomy in planning that retirement is key, partly for outcomes, but also partly for that sense of dignity and respect, which is about financial empowerment. And I say that in a context that financial independence and autonomy for women in this country has always by legacy been an inequality. And despite that, and in the earlier session we heard about 270,000 WASPI women who have already been lost and one dying every 13 minutes. For a long time, and I'm aware that the length of time has been suboptimal, and in the face of refusal by the government to accept our findings. The WASPI women have kept going. Jane Cowley said earlier they haven't gone away and they won't go away, and I just wanted to pay tribute to them and to recognise what has happened to those whose individual lives are at the heart of this. The other thing I just wanted to offer to do was just to go through the outline of our investigation. Would that be helpful?
If you summarise it, if you would, very briefly.
So, I mean, just for a couple of minutes. I know perhaps everybody here is aware of the report, but in case it's helpful. This was an investigation about DWP communication from 1995 onwards about changes to the state pension age for women and the number of national insurance qualifying years that was necessary for the new state pension. We also looked at complaint handling by the DWP and also by the independent case examiner. As Karl mentioned, we announced the investigation in 2018, and we then began to receive a lot more complaints. We accepted over 600 and had to craft a bespoke approach. We stopped accepting new cases after those 600 odd cases that we received. But we selected 6 that we felt were representative generally of the issues, of the injustice that had been impacted. We kept a log of all the complaints for the purposes of communication, but we investigated just those 6 sample cases going forward. The investigation had 3 stages. Stage 1 considered DWP's communication about the state pension age. Stage 2 considered DWP's communication about national insurance qualifying years. It considered DWP and the independent case examiner's complaint handling, and it considered whether any failings identified had led to injustice. Stage 3 looked at remedy. We published Stage 1 in July 2021, and that found that between 1995 and 2004, communication about state pension age met standards in terms of information being available. But in 2005, research conducted the previous year showed that the information should be disseminated in a more targeted way, and DWP essentially failed to give due regard and to that, and continued communicating in the same way instead of looking at improvements to service design, and that was maladministration. In 2006, further research showed that the information was not reaching those that it needed to reach. DWP proposed writing to women individually to tell them about changes to state pension age, but failed to act on that promptly, and that we also found to be maladministration, and that maladministration led to delay in DWP writing to the affected women. In March 2024, this year, we published Stage 2 and Stage 3 in a single report. We found that there was clear information available in relation to changes to national insurance qualifying years, but the DWP did not use that research, showing that it wasn't reaching the target audience in terms of improving their service design, and that was maladministration.
Right, can I just interrupt you? You made the point that there was the need for communication was identified in 2005, 2006, but nothing seems to have been done at that particular time. Do you know why not, or have you been able to find out why nothing was done?
I don't think I can comment on why. I can only comment on the fact that we knew that the DWP had the research, and we knew what it was telling them about whether or not it was reaching the women involved. But our investigation didn't show that sufficient action was taken on the back of that, or sufficiently quickly.
Okay, I think the other points probably will come up in responses to questions from my colleagues. So, Debbie Abraham.
Thank you very much. Hello there. Again, you probably heard the questions that I posed to the previous panel, and I just wondered if you had anything you really wanted to add to that about why you chose to deliver the report to Parliament rather than to the government's DWP department.
Absolutely, no, that's really helpful. Thank you for opening that conversation. I think it's important to say for the record that over 99% of our reports meet with compliance by the organisations we investigate. In some ways, that's a key outcome of the way we work. I know that we'll come on to our investigation, but it obviously is punctuated by times where we provide provisional views, we listen to comments, we look at feedback, we adjust what we're saying. And the purpose, the methodology by which we work is about bringing people with us, and that largely, almost entirely, in fact, is successful. On an extremely small number of occasions, 3 or 4, I believe, over the past decade, we have laid a report in Parliament because of non-compliance. This instance was unique because, in fact, we laid the report in Parliament without first going to the body in jurisdiction and giving them the report. And the reason for that was that during the course of our investigation, we had been given repeatedly to understand that the department did not accept our findings. And going back to the previous conversation, we know that 270,000 WASPI women have already sadly died. We know that time is of the essence. We know it impacts on a very large number of people. And we didn't feel that it was appropriate to go through what our experience and our communications with government led us to believe would be essentially quite a prolonged conversation, a wait-and-see space. And we thought it was appropriate to go straight to Parliament in order to essentially speed the process up.
And given the conversation that we had with the previous panel, you'll be aware of the difficulties that Parliament will also find in this. Have you got a particular view in terms of how Parliament could devise a bill and have that agreed? What were the thoughts behind how Parliament could address this more speedily?
First of all, I acknowledge the challenge and the difficulty. And just to go back briefly to my previous answer, it's important to recognise that I am the Parliamentary Ombudsman, and that means that I'm appointed by Parliament to carry out the investigations that we do. I'm not a regulator, it's not what I'm there for. I'm accountable to Parliament through the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and therefore it's an automatic route for me if we don't find compliance to go to Parliament. And I recognise it's not a clear-cut situation. I recognise there isn't an obvious space to go to, but it comes within the remit of how the organisation was set up, what its job is, and how its accountability works. I think many of the obvious routes for compensation have been rehearsed. Obviously, we are enormously grateful for this select committee, perhaps other select committees, to exercise their time in holding the government to account. It is primarily for the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions at this point to set out their response to our report, and we have yet to hear that response. We hope that these committees can move forward to hold the government to account on that piece. We're also aware, again, this was rehearsed earlier in terms of that there is a debate coming up, there are private members' bills, but I recognise the difficulty that we are simply pursuing the course that is set out for us in our legislation as a parliamentary body.
Can I just... Oh, so sorry, Karl, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add, I mean, the context, it's unusual. We don't normally do 3-stage reports, and we could say something about that later on if it was relevant. It's unusual for us to do that. So we had, in fact, published stage 1. So it's a lot different to a conversation where there's a provisional view and it's unclear what the department might do. So when Rebecca said it was clear to us, it was absolutely clear to us. Stage 1 had been out there for some time. DWP had not accepted the contents of stage 1. And the second thing was just to underline how routine isn't the right word for this, but it is completely part of the way we operate. That if there is not compliance with a report, we lay it before Parliament. And so really, and I think the WASPI representatives recognise this. What we were just short-circuiting that process. What that doesn't imply is that we think there is a silver bullet for Parliament to do something about that. What we've always hoped, what's always been part of the system and generally supervised by PCAC rather than this committee, but it's been part of the system, is that the first thing the committee would be expected to do is to call the relevant permanent secretary and ask them to give an account of why they are not complying with the recommendations. There's a sort of process of engagement, and it's just moving towards that before the next stages of what you might do. And the other thing I'd say is I think we've been pretty clear in the report with deference to Parliament, so we've phrased it slightly differently than we would have done had it been a report going direct to DWP. We've been pretty clear about what we think the remedy should be.
Can I ask, this is a bit of an aside, but is the government's DWP, is that the only department that you have had these issues with?
Well, obviously, the specifics around communication around pensions is a DWP issue, but I would say actually that across both our jurisdictions, by which I mean health on the one hand and government departments and public bodies on the other, communication is probably up there in terms of one of the most common themes in terms of what doesn't go well. So I would say that, and the Chair's already alluded to the fact that this has been a very long-running thing, which is not specific to one government or another, and it's also an issue that we see cutting across every public body that we work with.
Okay, right. That's very helpful. I'm going to read this out if I may. So we've been questioned, DWP, about Miss Yu, an ESA case, where it admitted maladministration in response to an individual complaint but rejected your findings that there was a systemic issue to address. Is there a precedent for DWP rejecting a finding of maladministration altogether?
So the obvious answer is yes, and obviously the Miss Yu case, which you've outlined, this was 2 years ago, where the DWP did correct the error and pay the arrears to the individual impacted, but declined to pay compensation to, I believe, 118,000 other people who were impacted by the same error. It's not the case that the DWP is the only organisation we investigate who's ever refused compliance, but it is probably the most recent case where that's happened.
I don't understand. Well, you say 118,000 other people with the same issue as Miss Yu, and the DWP has not found that to be a systemic issue with the system. I don't understand really how they can't find that.
To be absolutely accurate, it wasn't that they didn't believe it was a systemic issue, and they did correct the error, but what they said to us is that going proactively out to those other individuals and offering compensation was not a reasonable or proportionate action to take. What they did say they would do would be to deal with it on a case-by-case basis. But obviously, and in a sense this goes back to the comments made by Jane and Angela at the previous panel, it's about the burden that you put on the individual citizen to recognise that they, first of all, to recognise that they have a particular right, and secondly, to go through the bureaucracy of applying for help. I know there's been an exchange of letters on this, and I think we talked about it when I was last in front of you, but I believe the number of people who've been compensated is in the double-digit figures.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Very much. Caroline Noakes.
Thank you. And you sat through the earlier evidence that we had. Can I ask how you respond to the previously aired concerns that have been repeated today that you were very modest in your approach to compensation and conservative, I think, was the complaint in your assessment of injustice?
Thank you. So first of all, I just go back to my previous comments. I do recognise the impacts on so many individuals, and I recognise that the WASPI women would have liked a higher level of compensation. First of all, I would like to stress, and Rebecca Long-Bailey, I think, made this point, that the findings and the recommendations that we made were based on the sample cases that we dealt with. We did not find any instance there of direct financial loss, but we don't exclude that possibly being the case in relation to other cases. The findings that we made and the recommendations that we made in relation to level 4 of our scale of injustice, I just think the point I wanted to stress is that obviously because we investigate other organisations in terms of maladministration and the need to properly comply with established processes, also applies to us. We have a very clear published scale of injustice which sets out the typography of complaints and with examples of injustice and what that impact looks like. And it is therefore really important that we comply with that, just as it is for any other organisations that we investigate. We looked at this very carefully, and we feel that the level 4 general description of what the impact looked like for individual women was right. And we also looked at the case examples cited both in relation to level 4 and also to the higher levels, and we felt that those indicated to us quite clearly that they were level 4 cases. It's worth saying, and I know I recognise the strength of feeling on this, and I recognise the hardship. When the previous panel looked at this and talked about level 6 compensation, we look at level 6 compensation under our health jurisdiction for potentially avoidable deaths. It's an extremely serious level of impact, and this is from an organisation that isn't primarily about financial compensation. Most people who come to us are motivated by the fact that they want an apology and they want the system to change to ensure that other people don't suffer the same experience that they had. Excuse me. I know that I don't want to make in any sense a flip comment here, but we're not a tribunal or a court, and we're not going to award the kind of very high levels of compensations that you see in sort of negligence cases. So it's about looking at the context that we operate in, and the methodology that we use and the output that we're looking for. Do you want to add to that, Karl?
No, I don't think so. I think perhaps the only thing I'd add is that the language necessarily overlaps in the descriptions. It's quite easy to read any of the descriptions in our scale of our remedy scale and think it could apply to a serious or a non-serious event. So you have to kind of look at the comparators, as Rebecca said, and you have to think about why they overlap and so on. So I think we have to apply it consistently, or as Rebecca said, we would be doing what we ask departments not to do, which is not applying our guidance. But it's understandable why people would read the remedy guidance and think, well, why wouldn't it be here? We do understand that.
And did you consider that if you'd widened the number of cases you looked at, you might have come to a different conclusion?
Well, I think this probably comes back to the question of the extent to which any compensation scheme needs to be individualised. But the truth of the matter is, we looked at the cases that we had. We stopped looking after we had 600 cases, and the 6 cases that we took were representative of the 600 that we looked at. I know that there's an important conversation to be had about the length of time that we spent on the investigation, and I'm very happy to have that, and I'm not here to say we don't have lessons to learn. But if we looked at thousands of cases so that we built in to our investigation any perhaps that came to us with direct financial loss, it would have taken many more years.
And if there had been an assumption that the DWP should have been more urgent in its communications with impacted women, might that have resulted in a higher level of compensation?
I'm sorry,
so if you had worked on the premise that the DWP should have been much more urgent in its communications with women, if it should have given far more notice than it actually did, might that have led you to the belief that the individuals impacted should have had a higher level of compensation?
Do you mean if in a speculation, if the DWP should have communicated 10 years before instead of...
absolutely.
I mean, that might have had an impact, because it might have meant that the impact on individuals on average was worse, because time is a factor. It is a factor in our consideration. It might have done.
And you changed or did you change your guidance, and why? So that in cases like this, remedies would be based on the severity of the injustice rather than reflecting actual financial loss? Or has your guidance stayed consistent?
So since I've been at the organisation, the guidance has been consistent. What we did do after I joined was publish it. We reframed the guidance before I was there, and I think the point being made, I think there were some subtle differences in it, but I don't think we necessarily intended it to look different to as it did. I think with reference to equitable life, but when we published the guidance, we wanted to make it absolutely clear how it worked. So, and that led to a conversation about direct financial loss and so on, which you've seen referenced in the conversations we've had.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I put to Angela and Jane the question. I'd be interested to know your comments on this. Does the Ombudsman take the view that citizens have a duty to keep themselves abreast of changes in the law that affect them? And is your thinking on that subject reflected in the recommendation you made about compensation here?
I think I'd probably answer it the other way round. I think that public bodies, public sector bodies, and actually private sector bodies as well, have an obligation to ensure that their services are user-focused. If there's one thing that I would like the DWP to take away from this, is to ensure that it's working with service users to ensure that actually the information that it's providing is reaching the target audience. And that, as we know, lies at the heart of the maladministration that we found, because they weren't. I don't think it's possible to issue guidance or information of any kind and just assume that the world that you're releasing it into is homogenous, and that because you can press a button and it can be on this channel or that channel, everyone's going to read it the same. We live in a world where there's a huge emphasis, rightly so, on inclusion, and part of that is recognising that some people need more support than others to understand what's actually, in this instance, really complex information, and some people will be more impacted by it. And therefore, while on one level it's absolutely true, and I think again the previous panel made a comment about ignorance of the law not being a defence, and that's obviously a reference to criminal law, it's nevertheless the case that we have a more sophisticated understanding at this point about the need to ensure that if you are providing a public service, it's actually engaging with people in the way they need to be engaged with. And if that fails, then the service fails, and that's actually not the purpose of the service or the objective of the way that we work in this community.
Yeah, very well put.
Do citizens have responsibilities in this area? To be in, I mean, what sort of...
I don't think I'd say they wouldn't, but I think the primary actor here is the service provider, and that's probably the best place to start if you're looking at why this went wrong.
Karl, yeah.
The DWP themselves, and this is just quoting from our report, quoting a DWP policy statement, says all information provided by DWP should be appropriate, relevant, correct, up-to-date, clear, concise, to the point, helpful and targeted. And it also says DWP has a duty to give information or advice to inform the public about any new policies and developments that may affect them, and crucially keep them informed on a continuing basis of their rights and responsibilities. It would be unreasonable for the department not to do this, and it's clearly a necessary part of our business. So, I mean, you could just say that all we've done is ask the DWP to do what it says it wants to do. Its research showed it that wasn't happening. It itself had told itself that it should do that. So to some extent, whether people should keep themselves informed is not relevant to what DWP itself should be doing in relation to its own policies.
David Linden.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let's play devil's advocate. You've asked Parliament to identify a mechanism to resolve the issue. Isn't the DWP better placed to resolve it?
Absolutely. We have written a report. It's been the report's been received by the department, and it is for the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to respond to that, and we are waiting to hear from him. And obviously we are happy, more than happy, welcome to have a conversation at any point. I should emphasise that we have had continuous involvement with the DWP, both at ministerial, at permanent secretary level and downwards throughout this. And we completely recognise that the best thing for the individuals in this case is for the government to address the findings.
And just to be clear, can Parliament implement a remedy without the government's support?
No, that's not really where our actions come from. I think I've been very clear that this is for Parliament to hold government to account in order for there to be a compensation paid to the individuals.
And is it fair to say that the government controls the parliamentary agenda?
That's the case, but I would also add that Parliament is composed of MPs, and we know that, I don't know whether all, but certainly the vast majority of MPs have affected constituents, many of the MPs in question have very helpfully worked with us, and we know the strength of feeling on their part, and that's true of some of you here today. And we expect MPs to be motivated by the need to help and support their constituents at this point.
Okay. There's a kind of widespread view that one Parliament cannot be bound by kind of a previous Parliament. The blunt reality is this Parliament will be dissolved this year. There will be a of an election campaign. What happens when this Parliament dissolves?
Well, in terms of any compensation scheme, that obviously depends on how far down the line it's got. But again, I come back to the fact that this is about, and I also recognise, of course, that not all MPs now will be MPs this time next year, but nevertheless, within a parliamentary democracy and recognising the strength of feeling across the board about what has happened, my hope would be is that if this Parliament can take steps towards a resolution of this for the benefit of people whom time is not on their side, that will send a very clear message to any succeeding Parliament and any succeeding government.
You mentioned earlier on that there's very much a kind of hope that the government will see sense, because ultimately, and you conceded earlier, the government controls the parliamentary timetable. Given the DWP's, I would argue, intransigence on this particular issue, did at any point the Ombudsman consider referring a complaint to the Cabinet Secretary, the most senior civil servant, about the conduct of the DWP in refusing to accept the findings in this case?
I think my answer to that is probably, forgive me, this is irritating, I'm repeating my previous answer.
Politicians do it all the time, don't worry.
Thank you, excellent, that's great. So I'm the Parliamentary Ombudsman. I've been appointed by Parliament on behalf of Parliament to carry out this particular investigation. And therefore, the recourse for me, given that I didn't see that the government was going to accept the recommendations, was to come back to Parliament and to do what the legislative framework asks me to do, which is to lay the report in Parliament.
Okay. And with this, I'll close, Chair. I hope this doesn't come to pass, because I represent a great number of 1950s women who are fed up with this. And I represent a constituency that is well known for having a very low life expectancy, and far too many have died already. But if, and this is a very serious prospect, if no remedy is provided, what implications would this have for the standing of the Ombudsman in the service it is able to provide if more and more of these women die in the exact same way 13 women will die during the course of the proceeding today?
So if I can answer that in two parts. I think it has enormous implications in terms of personal hardship and tragedy. And nothing about my answer takes away from that, and that's why I started this session by emphasising the importance of thinking about the individual human lives involved. But in terms of the Ombudsman, I go back to comments I made earlier. We are not a regulator. We don't work through hard enforcement powers. Beyond the vast majority of our cases meet with compliance. We do have a specific team that actually delivers mediation rather than casework, but even our casework is undertaken, yes, on an investigative basis, yes, looking at the evidence, but working to bring people together. When we make a recommendation, the action plan, the steps that are taken are owned by the organisation that we investigate because of that process of working with people and bringing them with us. A hard-edged enforcement plan that just says, well, under section whatever, you have to do this, wouldn't get us where we want to get to, because actually, although, and I come back to that sense of having two jobs, we need to provide access to justice for individuals who've suffered an unremedied injustice. But we're also about establishing a learning culture and improving public services, and that's absolutely inherent to how we work, and not being a regulator of the kind that would need the kind of hard-edged powers. And I do believe that because all the people who deal with us, both individuals and organisations we investigate, more than 99% of the time, that leads to compliance. My hope is that it wouldn't actually have any implications for the standing of the Ombudsman. Did you want to add to that?
We want everyone to comply with our recommendations, but it's implicit in the scheme that because we don't have enforcement powers, it may be sometimes that an organisation thinks it doesn't want to, and then the partnership is that Parliament, as our supervisor, will do something about that. And I think what would damage the standing of the Ombudsman is if Parliament declined to do that. So where we've gone to the serious step of laying a report for non-compliance, or in this case for anticipated non-compliance, if Parliament chooses to do nothing with that, that will damage the constitutional position of the Ombudsman.
And just to add to that, I think the constitutional conundrum, or the constitutional deficit, if you like, is really about the relationship between Parliament and the DWP. It's DWP ought to respect what Parliament says, both in terms of what the Parliamentary Ombudsman has said and also now what Parliament has said. And if there is a gap and if there is a problem, it's there. We are enormously grateful, this is where I started off, for your time and your consideration, and also for the actions of PACAC in this regard, because that is what the legislation aims to ensure happens, and that bit has happened, and that's really important.
Ms Hilsenrath. Thank you, Chair.
Very much. Caroline Notes.
Thank you. And I'm going to take up right there on that point. That bit has happened, so I know that you wrote to Sir Stephen as chair of this committee, to the chair of PACAC, and indeed to the chair of me as the chair of the Women and Inequalities Select Committee, putting it on our shoulders to make Parliament act. Do you share my fear that the DWP has form in this respect, and they might, in the same way that they wouldn't discuss with the WASPI campaign anything to do with it whilst the Ombudsman was looking at it, that the DWP might also take the view, oh, look at all these select committees, they're looking at it, we'll wait until they've come up with recommendations, which they might in due course ignore, and this has given them an opportunity to kick it into the long grass again. Well, I have enormous amounts of faith in you as a select committee and other select committees. I know that PACAC has written to the Secretary of State. At any point, the Secretary of State can actually cut short all these conversations by accepting the findings, and my hope is that he will. But I also hope that rather than having any sort of platform to wait until after the select committees have finished any considerations, that he will be part of this, and that select committees will ask the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary
Secretary of the DWP to come and talk to you, and therefore that becomes part of this process rather than something that happens afterwards.
I'm sure this select committee suffers from the same frustration that mine does, that we make recommendations to various government departments which then get rejected. What's the danger there that this committee makes a recommendation to the DWP and the DWP just rejects that? Where do we go next?
My hope is that, given the strength of public feeling, and we heard about this earlier in the WASPI campaign's recent survey that shows the number of people who believe that they should be provided with compensation, given how much that comes to bear in an election year, given the number of people impacted and given the amount of time that is being lost to those who are at the heart of this, that conversations can be had with the government that enable it to understand the need to act.
Thank you.
Thank you. A few questions about the recommendations that you made. The scheme you've proposed would entail payment to women who did know about the change and who made plans accordingly. Do you think that's a problem or not?
Well, I think that, and Karl may want to pick up on some of the detail of this. I think that this to an extent has been rehearsed in the previous panel. Our starting point is that any compensation scheme ought to look at every case on a case-by-case basis, to look at individual injustice and impact. And I actually am. My understanding of DWP guidance is similar, and that's how compensation schemes ought to happen across the board. That was the basis on which we wrote our report in the first place. Against that, it has to be understood that, again, time is not on the side of these individuals. It has to be understood that any compensation scheme needs to be looked at through the lens of managing public money, the Treasury framework, which does look at value for money and effectiveness and the amount of time that's spent simply on the mechanism for looking at compensation. I know that the National Audit Office is looking at compensation schemes coming out of a recommendation from the Public Accounts Committee, and I believe that's making recommendations later in the summer. Looking at what actually happens on a case-by-case basis is a balancing act, and I recognise that a flat rate is going to be the easiest and quickest way to go, but it will mean some women are undercompensated and some women are overcompensated. It was interesting listening to the previous panel who suggested a sort of two-tier approach whereby people whose injustice is perhaps more straightforward were given a quicker compensation, and others taken into a more complicated, more complex scheme. And there might be room within that space for some sort of low-level immediate payment with a provision for further payment beyond that. But it's a balancing act between time and money on the one hand and individualised justice on the other.
Your recommendation is for a level 4 scheme, and that would be regardless of the extent of the pension age increase that the individual experienced or how much notice they had, would it?
Well, within level 4 there's obviously a range.
Yeah.
And we also looked at that recommendation on the basis of the 6 sample cases. We're not ruling out the fact that there might be other elements, other cases where a different level of compensation might be appropriate. But it isn't just about the amount of notice, it's about lots of different factors in relation to each woman that would lead to the particular impact.
Yeah, I think our recommendation is if the department was going to do a flat scheme without investigation, then level 4, based on the six sample complaints we'd had, all of which were somewhere in that range, and it seemed very likely to us that most would be because of the range we'd had in the sample complainants. On the other hand, if the department felt that was inappropriate, because for the reasons you've said about compensation sometimes going to people who would have known, then it was open to it to design a different scheme that would potentially, but in that case we said it had to be proportionate to the issue for the reasons Rebecca said. It shouldn't be something which required lots of investigation. It should be something which enabled the department to satisfy itself, reduce, and manage in a different way. But it's for the department to set that out. It's an operational decision. But in a way, if we didn't set out the alternative approach, there's no kind of incentive to do that.
Are there precedents here that we could look at to see how comparable problems have been addressed in the past with compensation schemes, or is this really without precedent?
Well, there is a precedent for PHSO making recommendations for a compensation scheme in relation, in fact, to pension payments. But I wonder whether, in terms of looking at how schemes operate, it might be helpful to look at the current work being undertaken by the NAO, because they are making this report to PAC later in the summer, and therefore they must have been looking at a number of compensation schemes, and they would have the kind of evidence and data to inform one that needs to be set up now.
A couple of questions that are looking a bit beyond this particular case, very large though it is. You suggested in your final report that there's a systemic failure in the way that DWP responds to research and to feedback. What makes you think there is a wider problem than simply this one?
I think we pointed particularly to their response to research and feedback in this case. I think that if you've drawn the conclusion that we think there's a broader issue, then I think that might be based on the reaction to our report, which is not to, say, accept the particular case and say, but we're unable to pay compensation, not to apologise and acknowledge and to suggest what they're going to do about it, but say we're unable to pay compensation, but simply to say we're wrong. That might suggest that the lessons that should be learned from this haven't been learned. Although DWP, there is work going on there, we're told, to look at improvement and so on, but it might be taken that way. And I wondered if that was what gave you that impression.
I think in your final report you referred to a systemic failure, and I sort of understood that to mean that there was something in the way that the department looks at these things generally which was wrong.
I think we use the word systemic in that context because of the huge numbers of people affected and the period of time over which it occurred.
Right. Okay. As you say, the department says it has put things right by modernising and digitising. Do you think it has? Are you persuaded by that?
So I think, first of all, I think that the key thing that we would want to see from the department would be a commitment to learning to avoid what has happened, and there's a sense in which it needs to accept the findings before we would be convinced that that's happened. And that's really about being committed to a learning culture, especially because, and again this was discussed in the previous session, there will be further changes to state pension, so we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. I'd say three things. First of all, I think there's a really key thing here about learning from complaints. The central government complaint standards, which we launched in 2022, co-produced with government bodies, which I have to say the DWP has welcomed, although it hasn't sort of stood up as a trailblazer in that space. And the independent case examiner actually is a member of our working group, is really key in terms of helping governments, government departments and others to ensure that they're learning from complaints. And we would like to see that embedded in DWP and see that they're really learning what they can from when things go wrong. The second thing I've really touched on, I think that the thing above all that I would like to see DWP doing going forward is around ensuring that there's a user focus that's really embedded in how they're working, and that's about improving their understanding by engaging properly with those who use the service, those who have lived experience, benefits and pensions. We have our own public engagement and advisory group where we're working with complainants ourselves. We are finding this enormously helpful in terms of understanding how to make improvements to our service. I know that there are lots of third sector partners who would like to work more with DWP, and there'll be an opportunity to work together nationally and locally. And I think the last thing I'd say is that, yes, of course, we are aware of their modernisation programme, and we welcome that it will help in terms of technical improvements, but there's something also about demonstrating learning and change to Parliament, to select committees, to users. And yes, of course, a lot of that is about processes and systems and training, but it's also about ensuring that the culture is really changing in the way that we want it to, and that's really, in the end, what's going to make a difference in terms of timely and effective communications.
So is this about staff training? Is it changes to computer systems? If the department was to set about really learning the lessons that you've highlighted, what sort of things ought it to be doing, in your view, to...
My understanding is that the DWP has said that some of the things that were challenging in terms of rolling out communications as quickly as they should have was to do with the actual case management system, and I'm not here to sort of comment on that in detail. And of course, effective service provision is always going to be dependent to an extent on technical processes. But the key thing for us is about culture. So I spoke about the complaint standards earlier, and that's kind of quite a good example in a way. The complaint standards, which we rolled out, we have National Health Service complaint standards and separate ones looking at government departments and public sector bodies. Set expectations about how complaints will be handled. A lot of it is aimed at ensuring proper support and training for complaints handling teams, but it's a cultural piece that needs to be led from the top. When we published the complaint standards originally, it was on the back of some research we did where we spoke to leaders in many organisations who said, so tell us about your complaint handling work. And they spoke about how important it was and how well supported it was. And then we spoke to the complaints teams, and they said, well, they're undervalued and undertrained and under-resourced. How you learn from complaints is key for anybody, any public body, any private body. But that isn't just about the people on the ground. Culture comes from the top. It's a leadership issue, and it goes all the way through service, all the way through user focus, all the way through how you turn complaints into an opportunity to learn, as opposed to something to sort of bat away and protect yourself and be defensive about. And that's the key piece here for us. It's not about the case management system.
And finally, looking back on this 6-year period that you've been looking at this, are there ways that you think you ought to have done things differently that perhaps sort of led to a conclusion sooner? Are there lessons for the Ombudsman in what's happened in this time?
I can't say what I just said about the DWP without saying that we are a learning organisation. So I'll give you my view and I'll pass over to Karl, who may want to add to it. But of course we want to reflect, we always do after any investigation, and there has been nothing of the size of this, certainly in recent history, to learn if we could have done things better. I think it's important to say at the start that it was an extremely complex organisation, thousands of pages of very complex evidence, delays outside our control, and it's important that established processes do give us pause to consider and reflect, but there were also more than one legal challenge. We're looking more broadly at how we work in terms of systemic investigations. Karl may want to say more about that. I think there's some learning about what worked. So we had a lot of cross-organisational, multidisciplinary approach, which was really effective. Our stakeholder engagement throughout was really effective. I think one of the things that we would do differently, and Karl alluded to this, was our 3-stage investigation. And the reason why we did it was because when we looked at the cases, they were all pointing towards how communication flowed in terms of the 1995 Act changes. And I think it was felt that if we could address that first and then get that out, it would give people a sense of progress, and we were then able to look at everything else sequentially. I think looking back, we might say that actually that led to more delay. I think that we have some other learning out of it. I think I won't dwell on this question about whether we want more powers to compel. I think I've answered that point. We don't want to go into that regulatory space. We want to continue as an ombudsman to work with individuals and with organisations to support learning. I think I'd just say I'd add two other things, and I'll pass over to Karl. I think one real positive from this case has been the way we have worked with MPs, and I've said already this morning that many MPs have worked with us to support their constituents, and that's been an extraordinarily effective partnership for which we are really, really grateful. It is critical that partnership continues, but I think it's also fair to say that we have asked in the past, and we continue to ask, for the mandatory nature of the referral from MPs to be reviewed and discontinued, as is in fact the case in relation to the Victims and Prisoners Bill currently going through Parliament, where it's being discontinued for complaints under the Victims Code particularly. And that is about putting the individual at the heart of the process, because for all the many thousands of WASPI women who have come to their MPs, we know that there are many others who didn't. And in this instance, they were supported by the fact that their co-complainants, as it were, came to their MPs. But if it weren't for that, those women would have been, their voices would have been completely silenced. And we know that, and it's with enormous respect to all MPs, including those present, there are some people who aren't comfortable approaching their MPs, and we know that that builds in bureaucracy and delay to the process. So we feel that actually our learning from this process is that there's a stronger case to look at the mandatory nature of the MP referral. And the other thing I would say is that, going back to my comments about the complaint standards, for us, because of the failings in the DWP complaints handling, it underlies the importance of all government departments adopting our complaint standards and looking at raising levels of standards of complaints handling. We would like the Cabinet Office to be proactive here and to take a lead in working with all government departments to ensure that the complaint standards are adopted across the piece. But going back to our specific handling, did you want to add to what I said?
Sadly, our time is up.
Sorry.
We're going to need to... But if there were some other points you wanted to make, do drop us an email. We'd be keen to see those. Can I thank you very much for all the work that's gone into this, you and your colleagues. Thank you for your report, and thank you very much for being willing to speak to us this afternoon. That concludes our questions. It concludes our meeting. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.